Welcome back, DPReview TV viewers. It is Chris Nichols here. We're coming to you from beautiful Tokyo, and we're here to play with the brand new Panasonic S5 II. Now, we're very fortunate because I've got one to shoot photos on, but Jordan is also filming this entire episode on another S5 II, and he's going to do it completely handheld to test the brand new stabilization system in these cameras. Now, the Panasonic S5 II is the first Panasonic camera now to have, yes, finally, phase detect hybrid autofocusing. It's here, so you know we're going to be testing that quite a bit. Jordan is going to be shooting the episode using that autofocus, so you'll have a first-hand view of how it's actually working as well. Also, I do want to say, it's been very generous of Panasonic to fly us out here to put us up for this event, and they are sending us home with the cameras. We grabbed some lenses that we feel we needed to test it as well, so we have more time to test these at home. But also keep in mind that as DPReview journalists, we're regardless going to make sure that our video is honest. We're going to talk about what we like and don't like. It's not going to influence us in any way. And of course, also as journalists, we're going to be sending this gear back when we're done with it. So let's start things off how we usually do. We're going to talk about handling on the Panasonic S5 II. So it is actually very similar to the S5, maybe not the same build quality that you get with the higher end bodies, but it is weather sealed and it is lightweight and compact, and we do like that. So it does feel very familiar, but we do have some nice changes. We do have an improved autofocusing joystick on the back. Now we've got both dual UHS 2 SD card slots, same battery that we had before. This is nice too. We've now moved to a full HDMI port. And we got some other really nice changes here. So for video, there's actually a fan now built into the pentaprism area. It actually sucks air from just above the lens mount and then dispenses it where the dials are located, but it is actually still fully weather sealed. I do like this camera body. It's got a nice grip. It is lightweight. You've got nice control for white balance, ISO, and exposure comp, dual command dials. But one of the main weaknesses on the Panasonic S5 was a 2.36 million EVF. The problem there was, for its price point, it was just a little bit under spec. Now we've upgraded to a 3.69 million EVF, and that's on par with its competitors. Okay, so as I walk backwards, hopefully the new phase detect autofocus is doing a good job. You be the judge. Let's talk about what's at the heart of the S5 II, the sensor. So we still have a 24 megapixel full frame sensor, very similar to the S5. This is technically a brand new sensor because it's got a phase detect autofocus array built into it, but from what we can see, it's got a similar readout speed to the S5, similar image quality, still 24 megapixels. There's nothing wrong with that. That's perfectly fine for the price point of the camera, but we're not really seeing any improvements in overall image quality. Now, of course, if 24 megapixels isn't enough for you, we still have the similar higher res shooting mode that we found on the Panasonic S5. This is where it will combine multiple images, stack them together. It does have motion blur compensation, and you can get up to a 96 megapixel, be quiet, karasu, a 96 megapixel file out of this camera. And so in that regard, as long as you got a tripod, you can get more detail. Now that's all well and good, but to be honest, now considering we have an improved in-body image stabilization system on this camera, I would have liked to have seen like some sort of handheld higher res mode, like we see on the GH6. So that's unfortunate we don't have that. So the in-body image stabilization has been improved here on the S5 II, and actually it seems to be very stable. Jordan's going to talk about the video implications of that, but I've been very impressed with the photo implications. So I shot a couple photos here to see how slow a shutter speed I could go down to. I shot the 7200 f4 at 105 millimeters because that has image stabilization in the lens as well, and I get the Sync IS. I was able to get down to about 1/6 of a second sharply. Once I went down to 1/3 of a second, things just started to fall apart, but that's pretty impressive. Then I went and I shot the Sigma 105 macro that does not have IS, so there's no sync going on. And in that particular case, I was still about 1/13 of a second getting good sharp shots. So overall, it's an improvement if you've got Sync IS, but it's an improvement regardless. Jordan, I know I've asked you this like 30 times today, but are we actually rolling?
Yeah, we're rolling.
We're rolling, okay, because yeah, the lack of a tally lamp, I think honestly in this day and age is pretty silly. You should have tally lamps and everything, and it's driving me crazy. Okay, I trust you. So how does the S5 II perform as far as fast shooting goes? Well, it's pretty similar to what we've seen before. In electronic shutter mode, you can push up to 30 frames per second. However, we don't find the readout speed very good on this particular sensor. It's not that fast. So if I'm going to rely on the mechanical shutter, with continuous autofocus, I'm getting 7 frames per second. With locked off autofocus, I can push that to 9. These are respectable numbers for the price point, but I think it'd be better just for casual sports and wildlife photography. So I know the big headline feature that everybody wants to know about is the phase detect hybrid autofocusing system. This is only our first day. We got 3 more days here, and I really want to do some night shooting as well, see how it performs there. But I'll at least give you my initial findings. So first off, single autofocus, fantastic as always. It's still basically relying on its DFD system, which was very quick and very accurate. But for continuous autofocus, I love the fact that I no longer have those Panasonic focusing jitters. That's all gone. It feels very much like the experience you'd shoot with any of the other high-end hybrid autofocusing cameras. And so that so far has been quite smooth. I have been testing quite a bit the human face eye detect. That's working really well. It'll prioritize the eye, then go to the face. Then if it doesn't have that, it'll do the whole torso. So that's been working pretty well. Animal detect's been working pretty well on the birds that we've seen here. Not too much wildlife in central Tokyo. Now the autofocusing interface is basically the same as the S5, very familiar to Panasonic users. I'm not the biggest fan of Panasonic's aesthetic display for eye focusing. These gray crosshairs on the eye. I'd far prefer just a bright box right on the eye that it's focusing on, but you get used to it. However, I will say that the autofocus hit rate has been very good. I'm finding it very easy to predict where it's going to go. Again, none of those jitters are there, and so I'm really enjoying that experience. Seems very accurate, seems very quick. We got to do more testing, as I mentioned. We got a few more days. Besides, I know you really want to hear more about the video features of this camera, so let's go to Jordan now, and he can explain that to you.
Okay, that time-lapse transition means we're now in day 2, so it's me, Jordan, to talk about the video capabilities of the S5 II. And I know you just want to hear about autofocus, but I want to get my watch time up. So first we're going to talk about some of the other new features on the S5 II. Now, while this is a new sensor in the S5 II, that's just to accommodate the new phase detect autofocus points on it. Performance is very similar to what we saw with the S5 previously, so that means you do get 4K up to 60p, but unfortunately it does have to jump into a Super 35 crop when you use that. We get 1080 recording up to 180 frames per second, but quality is a little dodgy on that, but good 1080 quality up to 120 frames per second. Now 4K up to 30 frames per second is oversampled, so you're going to get very sharp video, very good low light performance, but it also gives you the option to use a Super 35 crop with any of the 4K modes. That's what Chris is shooting me on right now, and that is going to degrade your image quality a little bit, but you will get better rolling shutter performance, and that's a real drawback with this sensor. Rolling shutter, as you can see here, can still give you some very weird diagonals, and I really wish they'd upped the readout speed on this sensor. Okay, so if you're interested in doing raw video, well then the S5 II is not going to be for you. Unlike even the original S5, which gave you the ability to record external ProRes RAW out of its crummy micro HDMI port, this will not kick out any kind of raw video. But really interestingly, what Panasonic is doing is they're releasing a separate model a little bit later. It's going to be called the S5 IIX. Unfortunately, we don't have one to test here, but what that's going to unlock is the ability to do external ProRes to an external recorder, but also you can record standard ProRes video in a variety of frame rates and resolutions to an external SSD. It's an extra premium on that. It's going to be $200 more, but I think this is kind of smart. If you're a photographer or videographer who's not going to take advantage of any of those external capabilities, then you get a less expensive camera with the standard S5 II. So just like its precursor, the Panasonic S5 II is a 10-bit camera that does record using the full V-Log profile if you're recording log, but it does gain a few tricks from the GH6. So you now have the ability to load .cube LUTs onto the camera, and it'll now support up to 10 instead of the previous 3 LUTs. It's just a nice all-around upgrade. Genshin Impact, I guess Chris asked me to say. Let's talk about open gate recording. That's a feature that I absolutely love on this camera that has been carried over from the S5. It can use the full 24 megapixel 3x2 sensor to record video, which gets you around 6K recording, and it's so useful for reframing your shot. I mean, here you can see very easy for me to pull a nice 16:9 frame out of it, but then I can also get some nice vertical video out of it as well, as you can see right here. And sometimes it's just nice to have that boxier frame, especially if you want to play with anamorphic lenses. Just like a lot of other Panasonics, the anamorphic support is fantastic. The stabilizer can take the squeeze factor into account to stabilize properly, and you'll see a de-squeezed image right through your viewfinder. It's extremely handy. I could see myself using the open gate recording on this all the time. Chris, what did I say? Was it racist? So I always say audio is just as, if not more important than video, and there are some nice new audio additions here, but because audio is so important, that means this is a terrible location that you picked, Chris, and we're gonna go somewhere else. Come on. So the GH6 introduced a lot of really cool audio features, and a lot of those have been carried over now to the S5 II. Most importantly, we can record 4 channels of audio into this using their XLR1 XLR audio adapter. That'll get you 2 XLR inputs, and then you can use the 3.5mm stereo mic input on the body for your 3rd and 4th audio tracks. Also, the GH6 brought in their new audio interface. Now on the GH6 it had a dedicated audio button you could tap. The S5 II unfortunately doesn't have that, but you can assign any of your custom buttons to bring up the audio interface. Just makes it very quick and easy to change all of your audio settings. In this price range, I think this is the best audio setup you can get in a full-frame camera. Chris already mentioned that this camera has a really smart design for the fan, and if you go into your custom settings, there's the ability to have the fan constantly running, or you can adjust how fast it's going and at what point it kicks in. Now we do get unlimited recording in 4K up to 40 degrees Celsius, but this camera is capable of doing some higher resolution recording, so I'm going to cut to Future Jordan, who's done some overheating tests. Take it away, Future Jordan. Oh, hello. Future Jordan here to talk about overheating if you do use some of the more demanding record modes. So I don't have access to 40 degrees Celsius. It's actually freezing cold in Canada right now. But using the 6K 3.2 open gate recording, I was able to record for an entire battery and there was no overheat warning on it at all. So unless you're shooting in extremely hot climates, which I can't test, I don't think you'll have any issues with overheating even using some of those more demanding record modes. After using the S5 II for almost a month, I've made a few discoveries that Jordan from the past was unaware of. First of all, if you're recording in those high-res modes, like the 6K open gate, and you plug an external monitor into the camera, then you are going to lose the subject detection autofocus. So if you're relying on those two features working in conjunction, I don't know if it's a processor limitation or what, they aren't going to work together. But also, since I tended to stick to using autofocus when I was filming in Tokyo, when I actually switched over and shot some stuff with manual focus, I was delighted to find that much like the GH6, this has the ability to punch in and check your focus while recording, whether you're in manual focus or autofocus mode. And it does seem to be a much sharper display when you punch in than what we saw in the GH6, making this feature quite a bit more usable. But let's go back to past ignorant Jordan and see what he has to say. One of the biggest upgrades on the S5 II is we've got an entirely new algorithm for the in-body image stabilization when you're recording video. And I've always found the S-series stabilization quite good, especially compared to a lot of the full-frame cameras, but the Micro Four Thirds cameras were still quite a bit better in my opinion. What we're seeing now is I think they're very nearly at par. The S5 does a really great job of controlling vertical bounce in the shots, but we do still get a little bit of horizontal side-to-side movement that can be a little bit distracting. And this is very good. I'd put it up side by side with some of the Olympus OM system cameras that I consider the real benchmark, but also they've dramatically improved the boost IS. Chris has switched over to it right now, and this is designed for when you don't want any movement in the camera, a perfectly locked off shot like what we're doing right now, and it looks like it's on a tripod. If you're not planning to be walking with the camera, the boost IS on this makes it the best stabilized camera I've ever tested. So as soon as the briefing on this camera started, Panasonic has been touting their new phase detect autofocus, touting how it's going to be such a great option for video, so you'll get rid of that wobbly DFD autofocus system we've been putting up with for years. So let's talk about how it actually functions. So Panasonic has basically left the video autofocus interface unchanged, just like they did on the stills side of things. But what we're seeing here is just a much more decisive system, especially when we're doing like talking head stuff. You can set it on the human face eye detect, and it's actually doing a really good job of picking your initial subject and sticking to it. Overall, for this kind of stuff where we're presenting to camera, the camera has done an excellent job in its human detect mode. The only time it struggled with a human subject is when both the camera was moving and the subject was moving and the distances changed rapidly. It would just be a little bit behind the subject, take a moment to catch up. Where we noticed a few more issues is when you're following non-human subjects. The camera almost hesitates for a second before it starts to smoothly pull focus, no matter what your focus transition speed settings are. I think this is probably something they could iron out in firmware, but I did notice it several times. If you've got the time to set it up, this does have the excellent focus limiter that we first saw in the GH6, and this lets you specify the range that the camera is allowed to focus within, and it works very similar to the GH6, make sure that the focus is more consistent, but now we don't have any of those DFD wibbly wobblies while it's working within this range. If I were to compare this to the focus of other cameras in the price range, I would certainly put the autofocus here above the Nikon Z6, which I find quite inconsistent, or above something like the Canon EOS R, Canon EOS R6, which has a tendency to constantly jump to the background in your shot. I do think the Sony a7 IV is just a speedier and more consistent autofocuser, but it's also quite a bit more expensive. If we're looking in the same price, then this S5 II is certainly better than the a7 III that's available around that same price. And it's certainly more than competitive. Now, if you're looking around this price, you might notice that there's a GH6 available for a very similar price, and that's a micro four thirds sensor as opposed to the full frame we have here. Well, I think they really do both have their place. The GH6 has the much faster readout that's going to give you 4K 60, 4K 120 without a crop. If slow-mo is important, that's definitely the way to go. As well, you'll get all kinds of higher data rate options. But if you're looking for a run-and-gun camera, especially in low light, the S5 is clearly going to be the better option there. And if you compare it to any of the other full-frame cameras in this market, just in terms of video functionality, the S5 is the better way to go. We've got waveforms, custom LUTs, open gate recording. If you love video, the S5 is the direction you should be going.
Okay, so let's talk about autofocus performance now that I've had a few days to play with the S5 II here and really try different settings. So first off, I'm gonna say, I already like the experience of having the phase detect hybrid. That's a noticeable improvement. How did it actually perform though? Well, it's a good first attempt. And actually what I will say is, especially when set to responsive autofocus, it did a really good job of just pointing the camera, having a subject come into the frame and then immediately zapping to that subject and getting a good accurate shot. It also did a really good job for static portraits where I don't find I'm really getting back focusing or eyelash focusing very often. However, moving subjects, even tweaking the settings, trying to get the autofocus to be stickier, it was decent but not perfect. We did have an okay hit rate, but you'll notice that there are still quite a few shots where it's just a little bit out of focus, or it tends to be even just behind the eye. I got a lot of Jordan's beard, not a lot of his eye when he was running towards the camera. I tried this both in tracking autofocus and in zone focusing, and I still got very similar results. So the last thing I want to mention is I got a chance to test the camera in quite low light situations, and actually I found the autofocusing to be a very similar experience whether I'm out during the day or in pretty low light situations. So the basic story here is that Panasonic has taken the S5 platform and now they've updated it to be very competitive and very comparable to the contemporary cameras in its price point. Especially now that we have that phase detect hybrid autofocus, we don't have that disadvantage anymore. Image quality again, very similar to the other cameras in this price range. Autofocus performance now frankly very similar as well. You know, maybe I would say it's got a slight edge over a Nikon Z6 II, very similar to Sony a7 III. Maybe the Canon EOS R6 is a little bit more effective with face eye detect autofocus and its hit rate, but you know, again, it's very comparable. But one of the only disadvantages I will say, it doesn't have a great burst rate. 7 frames per second in mechanical shutter mode with continuous autofocusing. Many of the other cameras can beat that. But overall, we do have a pretty competitive platform here with an IBIS unit, which is very stable. Only the Canon comes close. It is clearly better than what Nikon and Sony offer for their in-body image stabilizers. We have a pretty competitive package. For a photographer though, if I want a more consistent autofocus performance, I could spend more money and go to the a7 IV or
the Canon EOS R6 Mark II. Those would certainly outperform this very clearly, but they are more expensive cameras. So why would you then buy this? What's the strength? I think it's really if you want to do hybrid photo and video work, because as a video camera, this camera is well above anything else in its price point, even very comparable to quite a bit more expensive options in the video world. And that's really the reason why you might want to take a hard look at the S5 version 2. Anyways, I hope you guys enjoyed that. Please leave your comments below. Don't forget to check out our sample gallery at DPReview.com. You can see the shots that we took here in Japan and judge for yourselves. Instagram, Twitter, please subscribe to the channel. Please click that notification bell. But we're sad to leave Japan. When you see us again, we'll be back in Calgary for another episode of DPReview TV.